Welcome back, farmers. This is We're All Ears, the Golden Harvest podcast mini-series airing throughout Harvest 2021. My name is Carah Hart. I'm glad you're listening in today. Last episode, we talked recommendations for creating the best 2022 soybean crop plans. This week, we're diving into the carbon market to understand what role farmers can play in it, in addition to identifying opportunities where farmers can get more sustainable, economical, and productive in their operations. I'm here with Liz Hunt, the head of Sustainable and Responsible Business at Syngenta, and Chris Cook, head of Enogen at Syngenta Seeds, to help out. Let's get started. This is We're All Ears. Hey there, Liz and Chris. We can't wait to dive into this week's topic. Before we get started, tell us more about your experience in agriculture and what you do in your current roles. Liz, we'll start with you.
Thanks for the introduction. So Liz Hunt, I lead our Sustainable and Responsible Business team for Syngenta. I grew up on a small farm in eastern Iowa and have a background in flower breeding, actually, and have been working in the sustainability space for several years here at Syngenta. My team and I work across our commercial businesses to look for opportunities to help growers tell their sustainability story, particularly through data, and looking at their on-farm data to better look at that through a lens of sustainability. Also work with our portfolio as well on how our portfolio can contribute to sustainable outcomes. And then also leading our efforts around our Good Growth Plan, which are our commitments to sustainable agriculture.
Liz, you have a very interesting job. Thanks for sharing a little bit more about it. And Chris, tell us a little bit more about what you do with Syngenta.
Yeah, Kara. So I actually head the Enogen business today, and I've done that for about the last 2 years. And you'll learn a little bit about Enogen as we get into our conversation. I always think it's interesting. All my friends were farmers when I was growing up, and I started out in the grocery business. I always thought I was going to be a grocery store owner, and got into agriculture because I just wanted to be a farm kid like everybody else. So I spent the better part of my degree actually as an agronomist and did that, and then got into stewardship and stakeholder relations. And so now in the Enogen business, I feel like I have the ability to pull it all together from the grocery store all the way to agronomy and how do we actually produce a better steak or a better gallon of milk.
Thanks, Chris. Let's go ahead and dive into some background information about our topic today. Carbon Market 101 for farmers. Liz, can you give an overview of carbon emissions trading and what it means practically for farmers?
Sure. So agriculture carbon markets are emerging as a mechanism to influence change for on-farm production practices and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's certain agricultural practices that can also mitigate against some of the impacts of climate change by sequestering more carbon in the soil or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So to just give kind of an overview of how these work, you kind of have to think of kind of a whole system approach here. And it really starts with all companies are generating emissions. It's just part of doing business. Every business is going to generate emissions in one way or another. And they look at that kind of across their entire footprint. So from the inputs of ingredients or manufacturing materials through whatever's happening within their own four walls to getting the product to consumers and consumers using that product. So they go ahead and look across that, and that defines what their emissions footprint is. So some companies are looking to achieve net zero emissions or be carbon neutral, and that's being driven by a number of different factors. But in order to achieve that, there's certain things that they can do within their production or their manufacturing or their operations, but then they have to look outside of that to find opportunities to meet their commitments. And agriculture and forestry practices are seen as one of those potential solutions that can reduce or sequester carbon in the soil. So these benefits, with these practices that are adopted, and we hear a lot about no-till or cover crops. With those practices, we can measure what that carbon reduction or carbon sequestration is, and then we can assign a value to that. And those are always measured in CO2 equivalents. So, all the greenhouse gases are then broken down into a CO2 equivalent. And then those credits are then sold through registries to companies who are seeking to reduce their footprint or have done everything that they can and can't quite get there on their own. So they need to look for other opportunities. So those emitters and then people who can fix the problem, sell it, and back to the company.
So essentially a way for companies to stay green in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's a way for companies to meet their commitments, depending on, what their driving factors are. So as we look across this, there's different carbon markets. So not all are created equal. So just really understanding what the different types are out there. And I've tried to kind of break it down into kind of simple ways to understand it, because that helps me to better understand kind of how these things are coming together. And there are more regulatory markets. So those would be regulated credit trading. So these carbon credits are traded on a regulated asset market. So there's laws in place that say you can emit as a company a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. If you go over that amount, then you need to bring it down. Or if you're under that amount, then you can sell credits to other folks. So it's often referred to as a cap and trade type of program. So that is one of the regulated programs, and probably the best example of that is the California Cap and Trade program, which I'm sure quite a few farmers are familiar with from ethanol markets. The other way to think about this is more voluntary credit trading. So this is really kind of more similar to what I was describing earlier, where companies have voluntarily made commitments to reduce their emissions or reach carbon neutral, and they're going to acquire credits against that. So they're doing that voluntarily, driven by whatever factors that are driving them to do that. So that's a little bit more of what we're seeing emerge across the landscape right now for agriculture, is more voluntary credit trading. And then really looking at voluntary funding. And that's really to bring funding to the agriculture community to help implement different practices on the ground that can help with emissions reductions on the farm or carbon sequestration. And oftentimes those really are falling within a company's supply chain. So for the manufacture of ingredients, for example.
Liz, how should farmers decide if and which carbon market type to be involved in?
So it's going to be a personal decision for each of the farmers, and they'll have to make that for themselves. But there's some fundamental requirements that farmers can consider as they are looking at the carbon markets and what makes sense for them. So understanding some of the basics, like, what are the practice requirements that I would need to adopt? If I have adopted practices in the past, do those count? Or are there rules in place around what's called additionality, which says, hey, you've got to do something new on farm in order to generate a credit? Understanding the length of the contract, for how long do you need to continue a practice or continue providing data? Looking at, some of the administration, if there's additional fees and such, do you need to do soil sampling? How frequently do you need to do soil sampling? And just understanding the applicability of those practices to your geography and your farm.
Well, and if I could build on that a little bit too, Liz, one of the things you brought up, contracts, is really important. Not only how long might this carbon contract be for? Is it 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 1 year, whatever that is? But also, if you're renting ground, you need to be mindful as well of what the agreement is that you have in place with your landlord, because that may have an effect on what you can do, not only just in the length of time, but what you can actually do with those acres as well.
Liz, what kind of commitments are agriculture companies making around
Absolutely.
Climate and carbon?
I think a lot of agriculture companies see that they can play a role in these emissions reductions opportunity. And every company is going to look at things a little bit differently based on their needs, based on their footprint, based on what they're emitting, and based on what their potential is for actionable changes. If we take Syngenta, for example, Syngenta has our Good Growth Plan, which are our commitments to sustainable agriculture. And one of our commitments there is striving for carbon neutral agriculture. So we have made a commitment, for example, to reduce the carbon intensity of our operations by 50% by 2030. So looking for opportunities to optimize production of the inputs that are going into our products over time.
What do these company actions essentially mean for consumers?
Sure. So some of the company's actions for consumers, so this can bring, more sustainable products to markets. And that's something that several consumers are looking for to better understand the sourcing of the products that they're buying or the food that they're eating, and having better transparency to how that food is being produced.
Speaking of identifying opportunities where farmers can be more sustainable, economical, and productive in their operations, Syngenta's corn portfolio includes Enogen hybrids, which offer some sustainability advantages in ruminant animals like cattle. Chris, could you share more about the advantages that Enogen hybrids offer in terms of conserving carbon, water, electricity, and land use?
Yeah, so Enogen is a corn hybrid, and it was brought forward about 10 years ago, and primarily it was used in the biofuel space, but we found feed efficiencies when using Enogen. We found that through university testing at like University of Nebraska, K-State, Penn State, Ohio State. And every time we did studies, we continued to find about 5% feed efficiency. That sounds like a really convenient number, but ironically, that is in fact the number that it continued to come up with. Is about 5%. If we fed it as silage, it was about 5%. As whole corn, dry rolled corn, steam flake corn, whatever we did, it was always about 5%. Where it really gets interesting, though, is when you start to think about the implications of 5%. And I had an account lead tell me just today, said, I was talking to a grower about using Enogen. What was interesting is they were hauling manure at the time. And I said, what if you could haul 5% less manure? And they're like, amen. I'd love to be able to haul less than that. That's part of what we do. When it takes 5% less to feed that animal to get the same product out the other side, you can do a lot more, right? So maybe it's 5% less electricity that you need. It's 5% less manure, 5% less water. Water is a big topic for people. 5% less land to create the same crop. All that are things that tie together into what Enogen can really bring into the marketplace. And we think it's a real advantage. Where we see that advantage really get interesting is a lot of what Liz was talking about, right? There's companies that are looking for offsets. They're saying, hey, we want to do something that brings the better value. We've changed all the light bulbs we can, changed the fleet as much as we can. We need something more. And that's where Enogen can come into play. We did some work around something called a life cycle analysis, and I'm sure
Chris?
Liz can probably explain it better than I.
Yeah, before we get into that, real in depth, I know life cycle analysis, not everyone listening to the podcast may know what that is. Can Liz or Chris, either of you jump in and explain a little bit more what this is before we get too much in depth with the life cycle analysis?
I'll probably let Liz do it because generally it's my kids telling me what I shouldn't do, but we'll let Liz do it.
Great. Thanks for that, Chris. It's one of those kind of geeky sustainability terms, but a life cycle analysis it's really a tool for analyzing the environmental impacts and resources used throughout a product's life. So it looks from the raw material extraction that goes into producing a product, all the way through the product's use and end of life or disposal of that products. And in the agriculture or food space, it's really considered kind of the gold standard for understanding the environmental impacts of a product across agriculture. So that's a life cycle assessment, life cycle analysis.
So if you look at Enogen and you think about the life cycle analysis, which is essentially it's cradle to grave, right? How does Enogen perform from the beginning all the way to the end versus the corn you're using today? And what we see with Enogen, when you look at that 5% feed efficiency, is we see on 1,000 head of cattle, we'd save about 35 passenger cars off the road annually, about 50 football fields worth of land, 9 Olympic swimming pools, 25 homes. But you take that and you expand that out to 100 million cattle in the U.S. Those are really serious numbers. And that's what really intrigues some of the down the value stream players, when they think about 3.5 million cars on 100 million cattle, or 5 million football fields, or 2.5 million homes, I mean, that's really having a significant impact, and it's really exciting.
Chris, is there anything else you can share about what's been done across the value chain to enhance sustainability from a carbon perspective?
Well, as I look really back over my days in agronomy, and once you're an agronomist, you're always an agronomist. That's just the way it is. You can look at a lot of things that have changed. I think back to when I decided I wanted to be in agriculture, back when we were in the grocery business, and I'd go out and work for my friends that, they sent me in the tractor and I moldboard plowed. And that's just not the way we do it today, because we found not only are there better ways to till the land, but there's better ways to save the soil. There's better ways to be more productive. All those things, that we just thought were a better way to do it, were also sustainable as we moved away from pounds of active ingredient to ounces or quarter ounces of active ingredient on a per acre basis. Again, that drives things that are more sustainable. And sustainable is the same as return on investment, because if you're doing the right thing, it's going to bring more to your bottom line as well. So as I look at the improvement in hybrids, hey, here's the new products coming out, they're going to perform better. That drives sustainability. They manage water better. They manage the fertility better. All those things help in driving sustainability.
What about the livestock industry and all aspects of the value chain? And maybe Liz can add in something here.
Yeah. So as I look at, what's happening across the whole value chain, I think there's increased recognition that in order to achieve sustainable outcomes, it's really important to be able to partner. So there's more willingness in the value chain to work more closely with farmers to help with resources, whether that's technical resources or input resources and such, to achieve these outcomes. So nobody can do it alone. And it's really great to see that's being recognized.
Chris, do you have anything else to add to that?
Well, I think it's a lot of what Liz was talking about. When you think about the value chain, there's consumers on the end of that are saying, hey, we want to know where our food comes from. We want to know it was more sustainably produced, and that drives behaviors by everybody in the value chain, from the retailer that's selling it to the processor that's converting it from raw milk into pasteurized milk on your shelf or into a steak, whatever it is, to the feedlot or the dairy and how they're producing it. Everybody along that chain is looking at it saying, we need to do something different. And some, to Liz's point, are making, statements saying we're going to be net zero by 2030 or 2040. And that's driving behaviors. But everybody through the chain is finding things that they're doing a little bit different and doing a little bit better to help deliver on that.
What's the approach if farmers are already doing great things? I think one of the questions that I know we get here at the network about these carbon markets are, this seems like it's set up for farmers who haven't started to do environmental changes or haven't started to make environmental changes on their farm to incentivize them to start doing that. But what happens to the farmers, or what's available for the farmers who've been doing this for years?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is there are different programs and offers out there that are looking back to reward those growers who have been leaders in their community by adopting practices and demonstrating that they can be successful in certain geographies. So there's certainly those opportunities that exist. And then I would also encourage farmers to look, what is there something else that they could add to their already good practices that can help them make them even better than they already are. So just understanding kind of the rules of the road and what's available to you. So I think there's certainly a place for everybody in this whole conservation space.
I think Liz is right. I mean, there's opportunity everywhere you turn with this. It's just, Liz makes this comment every day that, the carbon market changes every 2 hours, is it 30 minutes, something like that. So, as we move forward, it's going to continue to change and shape, but it's something I think it's here to stay. I think as we move forward, you're going to see water come more and more into play, and there's real opportunity.
So as we wrap up this conversation, what else would you like to share with farmers who are looking to join the carbon market? Liz, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the things that we were talking about at the beginning. But if there's one common denominator across carbon markets, or as other, Chris just mentioned water, as other ecosystem service markets emerge, it's going to require record keeping. So now is a great time if farmers haven't been keeping robust digital records. Now's a really good time to do that and really get your data house in order. Some of these markets will want to look back, but regardless, they'll all be looking for verifiable records. And Chris touched on this, but understanding some of the land rental agreements that you're in and whether they enable you to participate or not. Know that this is kind of new. There certainly have been agriculture carbon markets in the past, but there's a lot of more emphasis, and I think there's a lot more folks looking to see how this can work well for agriculture this time around. And really, work closely with your agronomist, work closely with your trusted advisor to understand how these practices will work for you. Focus on, strong agronomy, focus on, growing and producing the best crop that you can, and understanding how these practices will play into that.
Liz, what do you think of cover crops and the implementation of something like that? We're seeing a little bit more this year, it seems, interest, at least in my area of the country, that Dakotas and Minnesota territory. It seems like after the high winds this year, to improve soil conditions, a lot of folks have been out and seeding some cover crops. And I wondered, where does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, so cover crops are certainly a space where there's a lot of interest, and they're one of the list of practices that farmers can consider to incorporate into their operation. I think it's important to learn from farmers who have been doing cover crops. Work with your local agronomists and resources to understand how they would work for you, and understand what is the right mix for your geography, because everybody's going to be a little bit different, but really, doing what you can to learn. There's a lot of good cover crop seed suppliers out there who have a lot of great resources that can, point you to what would work, up in your area, up in North Dakota, where, versus, other places, maybe Central Illinois, where it's going to be a completely different game.
Are there other practices that you're seeing the folks that are signing up for these programs that really have an interest in? Are there some areas of conservation where they're really gravitating towards? Any trends?
Yeah, I mean, when you read about these or hear some of the headlines around carbon markets and ecosystem service markets, it's really looking at, practices like conservation tillage, where there's still plenty of opportunity for that to be adopted kind of across the agriculture landscape. For certain cover crops, there's also looking at, nutrient management as well. And, a lot of folks are already doing variable rate applications, but there's some folks where that's still an opportunity for them. Or even, just giving a good look at your land and understanding, the productivity and their opportunities to transition some of that land to, biodiversity habitats like pollinator habitats and things like that. So the list is certainly longer than cover crops and tillage practices. And that's where I would encourage folks to look to see what works for them. It doesn't have to be everything. It can be just one thing, and just start somewhere to see what would work for you that fits your agronomic system.
Chris, what else do you have to add as we wrap things up here today?
Probably just two thoughts that have both already been shared. I mean, the first one is, sustainability, whether it be carbon markets or water or conservation tillage, it's going to have a positive return on investment for you. The ROI has got to be there, and sustainability drives ROI, and ROI drives sustainability, and they go hand in hand. And, to Liz's point, which is my second one, is, and she says it all the time, it's just one thing, right? You don't need to dump the whole bucket and start over. What you need to look at is there one thing I can do in my operation that I can tweak a little bit? And maybe it's the way you're doing tillage, or maybe it's, whatever, the products that I'm using on the farm. It only takes one thing, and try that. And it may not work the first time. Try something different, but it just takes one little thing. And once you find the right niche, then, maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, try one more thing. But it needs to drive ROI, and you know what, it'll be a benefit for you and really long-term for your whole operation as well.
Chris and Liz, thank you so much for sharing your insight on the role agriculture plays in the carbon market. This is Golden Harvest, We're All Ears, and the next episode is our final for the year. Join us next week as we wrap up by reviewing this year's harvest and answering some audience-submitted questions as we look ahead to next season. Subscribe to We're All Ears on your preferred podcast streaming platform so you won't miss it. We're on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. And remember, just like you're listening, we're listening too. So join the conversation and interact with us at Golden Harvest on Facebook and Twitter, or at Golden Harvest Seeds on Instagram, and tell us what you think of this mini-series. Thanks for listening to We're All Ears. We'll catch you next week in our final episode.